Podcast 411, Item 239, February 18th, 2026. Brendan McDonald, producer of the WTF with Marc Maron podcast.
Podcast411.com. Listen different.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Rob, and this is the Podcast 411 podcast. Before we get into the interview with Brendan, first, a news item. I'm excited to announce that I will be continuing my podcast industry journey with Captivate and Dax as VP of Podcaster Relations. I want to thank all for the recent well wishes and kind words. It truly meant the world to me. I am looking forward to starting this new chapter with a team I really respect and who was already traveling in the direction I was. And as an added bonus, I get to work and podcast again with Elsie, someone I have the utmost respect for. The podcast space is the greatest space in media, and I am honored to get to continue to interact with and help podcasters as my day job. Thanks to Mark, Garen, and Brian for making this possible. They get the space, and I am thrilled I get to work with them on a daily basis. From the PR titled, Captivate appoints Rob Walch and Elsie Escobar to strengthen U.S. podcast growth and expand offering for advertisers in partnership with Dax US and Global. Quote, Captivate, the podcast hosting, distribution, and monetization platform, today announced the appointment of Rob Walch, longtime podcast industry executive and host of Podcast 411, to help accelerate Captivate's growth in the United States and further strengthen its podcast advertising and monetization offering in partnership with Dax US. Both Captivate and Dax US are owned by Global, the media entertainment group. Walch joins Captivate from Libsyn, where he served as Vice President of Podcaster Relations, working closely with creators and publishers across the podcast ecosystem for 18 years. In his new role at Captivate as VP of Podcaster Relations, Walch will focus on expanding creator and publisher partnerships in the U.S. and supporting the continued development of Captivate's commercial offerings. Captivate has also confirmed that Elsie Escobar has joined the team as Creator Success and Community Manager, supporting creator success and community growth. Elsie, also formerly of Libsyn, where she spent 18 years in the community management and podcaster relations, is the co-founder of She Podcast, the world's largest community of female-led podcasts. As Podcast Hall of Fame inductees, Rob and Elsie bring a diverse range of expertise and industry experience to Captivate's team and will take over its In and Around podcasting show to share fresh insights across the industry and continue to shape the medium alongside Captivate, Dax US, and Global, which recently launched Global Studios, a one-stop shop for podcast creators with best-in-class video and audio facilities, seamless distribution across all major platforms, and marketing power of Global's radio and digital and outdoor network. Mark Asquith, managing director for Captivate at Global, said, quote, Since I began my own journey in podcasting, I've watched Rob and Elsie give more to the industry than anyone else. Their passion and focus is unrivaled, and I'm excited to work with them as we continue to shape the future of podcasting, unquote. Brian Conlon, president, Dax US, said, quote, As Captivate and Dax US continue to work closely together to bring a specialized experience to the U.S. market, the appointment of Rob and Elsie adds a new dimension to our brand offering and serves to open up a new chapter in our business, unquote. Elsie and I will be relaunching the Captivate podcast, as mentioned in that press release. More on that shortly. Lots more on all of this that will be shared on future episodes of this and Captivate's official podcast, In and Around Podcasting. And now to the generic message. As always, your feedback is greatly desired. Please give us a call, 206-MOM-HELP. That's 206-666-4357. Or you can send your feedback or your show's promo to podcast411@gmail.com. Please, anyone you know that listen to the feed, tell them Podcast 411's back, and Rob and Elsie are back together on In and Around Podcasting. More on that shortly. Again, today's episode, we have an interview with Brendan McDonald, the producer of the WTF with Marc Maron podcast. Without further ado, here we go. Brendan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Rob.
All right. I have a new first question I like to ask people, which is, what was the first podcast you listened to?
Oh, the very first was probably The Best Show with Tom Sharpling. And I say that because I know it was the first thing I went to when I got an iPod and saw that there was like a category in iTunes for podcasts, because that was like the first thing I remember being told to be listened to as a podcast. So this is around 2007 or so. And I'm in the New York metro area, and people I knew, friends that I associated with, all listened to this show coming out of a freeform radio station in Jersey City called WFMU. And they always talk to me about this show with this guy, Tom Sharpling, and it's funny, and he's creating characters, and you got to listen to it. It's great music. And I just never could listen to it because it was on a Tuesday night, and it just didn't line up with my schedule. So it was the first thing I checked out when I was like, oh yeah, I can listen to podcasts now that I have an iPod, was Tom's show. But I was immediately listening to tons of podcasts, like right from the get-go.
When Mark decided to do the podcast, were you part of that?
Yeah.
You were working with Mark, right?
Yeah, we were working together. We've been working together from 2004. We started at the Air America Radio Network, which was invented at that time. That year was an election year, and the thought was this would be a pushback to the dominance of right-wing talk radio. And there were a bunch of celebrities that got started with it. Al Franken, Janine Garofalo. One of the people who organized it and got it started was Liz Winstead, who was one of the creators of the original Daily Show. And so it sounded like this big thing. And the story of that could be told on probably like a 10-part podcast sometime, of kind of what a disaster and weird success on some levels it was. But the bottom line is that's where I started working with Mark, and we worked together across 3 different shows on that network, the last of which was a streaming video show that they were trying to experiment with and hoping that it could save them in their dying days, trying to kind of update their media output. So they brought in Mark and Sam Cedar and myself to produce this 3 p.m. Eastern streaming video show that nobody watched, like maybe about a few thousand people. 1,000 people to 3,000 people would be the range. And the promotion of it was very poor, and the aggregation of it was even worse. So it was just this tiny, tiny audience. It probably cost them a ton of money, and they saw none in return. So we did that for a year, and then they wisely canceled it, and then the whole business was closed down a couple years later. But the result of that was Mark saying to me when it was done, well, what do you think about doing a podcast? And I think that for him, it was like, I have to have something going on, or I'm going to drift out to sea. And what I know is that a bunch of my peers are doing these podcasts now. Like, they are engaged in this. I don't really fully know what it is, but maybe I could do it. I think one of the things that was in his head was he felt he was like late to the game on the MySpace craze that happened like 3 years prior. And I think he just was trying to avoid being behind the 8 ball again. And he said to me, do you know what these are? And I was like, are you kidding? Like, I listen to multiple podcasts a day. You just didn't know that. He probably assumed I was listening to music or something. And so I was ready to jump right in. That was our entry to it. And we just kind of built it from the ground up. That was July 2009. And the first show we launched was September 1st.
I remember it launching. I was like, oh, yes. I think because we've known, and I reached out, I think first communicated with you, but it was like maybe within a month of the show launching.
Yeah, I think so. And we went with Libsyn as a recommendation from Jesse Thorne, who was hosting at the time. I think it was still called The Sound of Young America, later to become Bullseye, which it currently is today. And, Jesse was kind of Mark's like on the ground person in Los Angeles who could help out with this stuff because he already did a podcast. And, I remember him hooking Mark up with microphones, telling him which ones to get. And then when Mark got them, Jesse came over and, was like, yeah, that's good. And set him up here, set him up there. And Libsyn was his hosting service. And it was just what he recommended to us. And I, did my own research on things and was like, well, this looks as good as any. And, the bar of entry was very low, and it was not onerous for us to just fire it up and launch and start using the service. We started communicating directly with someone at Apple who was running the podcast page. It's so funny considering what it is
now. It was
now.
Pete and Scott back then.
Yeah, Scott Simpson, I think his name
Simpson.
was.
Yep. Pete and Scott Simpson. Yep.
Yeah, he hosted his own show, or was a co-host on a show called You Look Nice Today.
Yes.
And
it was hilarious.
Oh, and he was a fan of Mark's, or at least I should say, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he at least was like, oh, Marc Maron, the comedian, this is great. This is what we should be highlighting more of, right? There was just some sense that the podcast space at the time was kind of highly dominated by tech and radio shows, radio shows that were putting their podcast versions up and kind of highly promoting them. And this idea of original content by comedians was still pretty nascent. So I think Scott was into that. He was into the fact that we were so into it, and we were constantly working in concert with them. Oh, we could get you this stuff. We could get you this art. We could, do you want to feature us this week? Here, feature us now. And that's what I was saying. It's so funny knowing that kind of prized real estate of the iTunes, or now, Apple Podcasts carousel that features shows, and the lobbying that goes into it, and the kind of desperate straits that some content producers go through to get their stuff featured on there. And back then it was just you just email a guy, whether it was Scott or there was Steve Wilson at one point, you just were hey, I got something for you. You want to put it up? Yeah, sure.
I remember early on, there was don't mention Brendan publicly.
Yeah, that's true.
Are you allowed to talk about that now, or should we just?
No, yeah, for sure. I've mentioned it myself. It was the fact that I had signed a contract with MSNBC, and part of that was you can't be the producer of some other program if you're working in a news environment. I understand it totally. It was not just an exclusivity thing for the sake of keeping me off the board somewhere. It's it could be detrimental to the network if, Mark goes out there and says something, politically incendiary, and then, there's a news article about, yeah, this guy, he produces his show or whatever, and he works on, a highly visible cable show as well. So, it's basically no one can come at us if we're not acknowledging this, right? We're just, the show is you, Mark, and that's all it has to be. Nobody has to know what the show is other than this guy sitting in his garage turning on a microphone. So you just don't talk about me. That's fine. I don't need the recognition. I don't need to be, most shows don't have that. Although I would say, actually, now I'm incorrect. Most shows do have that now, because the producers are generally incorporated into the show content. But at the time, I don't think there was anyone questioning, how's this guy doing this? Doesn't he have a staff, or doesn't he have producers? No, it sounded, the DIY aesthetic of the show was kind of the selling point of it, frankly.
And the team really, for the longest time, was just you and Mark. I mean...
Yeah, the show is owned by an entity that is just Mark and myself, right? And then we kind of made it our goal to never have that change. So we never sold the show. We never broadened that company out to anything beyond the two of us. And so what wound up happening was, as the medium grew, we would wind up taking things off our plate, along with the kind of increase of that on us as a workload. So, this is where Libsyn came in early in the game in terms of ad sales, because I believe the first thing we ever agreed to in terms of not just a one-off, I should say the first ads that we had on our show were I think Pop Records or Comedy Central Records, doing hey, can we pay you $1,000 to just mention this comedy album? And I just remember thinking what? $1,000? That's crazy. What? Of course, yes. And then the first time we signed something that was like a regular deal was like the Audible deal, which was, I think, pretty standard at the time. You can correct me on that, but it felt like it was a kind of thing that came into most Libsyn users that, like, if you want to be doing Audible spots within your show, check this box. Like, it was a very almost pro forma thing.
No, it was actually, you had to be at a certain level. So it wasn't, it wasn't widely available. It was open to a small number.
I get you. But I do remember it coming in and being like, I'm not even sure, is this real, right? Like so it's like a regular advertising thing, but that definitely seems like it was the first one that happened through you guys.
Yeah, that was the first one I brought to. It was the Audible one. Yep. And then I think later on it was like Ting or something like that, or I forget what the other ones were, but there were some others. And then you got a bunch on your own as well.
Yeah. And it became one of those things where just like, the plate gets full and you have to clear it off. And if one thing I think Mark and I are pretty consistent about in terms of kind of giving credit to the great celestial timing that, we happened to be growing right at the time that the industry was growing. And I'm not like, I don't think that was one or the other. It was just the timing of it, right? Like we both our show wound up being on the same curve as the growth chart for podcasting. And so one of the benefits of that was we had like the entry into emerging platforms, business partnerships, agreements that kind of then helped shape the industry. And so, when there became the opportunity to do, a kind of clearinghouse for podcast ad sales with, at the time, the company was Midroll. Like, we worked with them to kind of coordinate like what business they should be doing, because they'd be like, well, what is it you guys want? Well, we want ads that are more like this, creator attuned, and we can insert them natively into the show. Great, we'll go out and sell those. And their business wound up looking a lot like our business, and I'm sure like other podcasts that were coming to them at the same time. So we just had the good fortune of like the timing that we were in this happened at a time where this growth was going to affect anything coming at that time and going forward. So we had like the first pick of the prize at a lot of these cases.
But do you remember one of the downsides of being one of the popular ones early was personal audio?
Oh, for sure.
That was where you and Sam and Jesse, you mentioned Jesse and Sam already, all three of you guys got the letters from Personal Audio about, hey, we own this patent to podcasting and we're going to take all your money. Basically.
Yeah, that was scary. And I'm just kind of reviewing this stuff recently because there's a graphic artist. His name is Brian Brown, and it goes by Box Brown. And he is doing the graphic novel of the story of WTF. It'll be out later this year. And the way he's been doing this is kind of interviewing Mark and myself, and then we share supplemental stuff with him, and he's turning that into the art in the book. It's very fun. But what was not fun was going through the Personal Audio saga again, because that was so stressful. And we legit thought it was a very high possibility that it would be the end of us doing the podcast. And I would just go back to my full-time job at cable news, and we'd think about this thing that we did one time and wasn't that great before it got taken away from us. But I think the strategic fight that was put up around that by
Daniels, EFF.
Oh yes, yeah, Electronic Frontier Foundation. That was a contact we made through Sam Cedar. Mm-hmm. Sam, having the benefit of being a political show, had done a bunch of stuff with them, and they're a kind of digital advocacy group. They were big into net neutrality policy back then. So he was having them on his show a lot, and he connected us with them. And we just kind of made it like mutually beneficial for them to work with us on this. We would kind of continue to promote them and their cause, and they would look for a solution to this podcast patent, and eventually, kind of crowdsourced and found what they call prior art, which is used to invalidate a patent claim. And this guy's particular, if people out there don't know what a patent troll does or a patent assertion entity, they basically buy up patents for pre-existing technology and claim ownership of it. And what you're able to do it's very difficult to, it's not easy, is to establish that the thing that the patent claims existed before that patent. And they were able to do that because this patent was for like a broad cataloging system of audio. And that was what they were saying podcasts were, right? Podcasts are just basically a way to take an RSS and process it so that you're listening to these things in a row. And they were able to find it through an old service that sent you cassettes, magazines on cassette, I believe it was. Yeah. And that held up. It held up through multiple courts to the point where it was dismissed at the Supreme Court. They never took the case. We definitely felt a huge victory in that, as well as feeling like for many years we were stressed that the not just us, but a lot of podcasts would cease to exist.
Oh, I know. And that was very stressful times because it was the uncertainty. And
you guys, I don't know what was the, for us, we'd get a thing that basically said, we want to talk to you. And ultimately, like, you owe us a licensing fee for your podcast, right? So I can only imagine what it would have been for Libsyn or any other platform that they would be claiming you owe them for anything you have on your platform. I'm not sure.
Well, a lot of the podcasts they reach out to at the time were hosted with Libsyn, and we were working with Julie and the EFF and yourselves. And I remember talking with you guys, we talked with Jesse, we talked with Sam, we talked with Adam Carolla, and it was others, and it was concerning times. This was all back before, iOS 8 came out and became native in 2015. So we were talking about, it was 2012, 2013 time. And I think it was dismissed in early 2015 or 2014, somewhere around there, that it wound up getting.
Yeah, that was when we kind of knew we were in the clear.
Yep. And then iOS 8 came out, and that was big. And then Serial jumped on that, and then podcasting continued its path forward. But you guys obviously were one of the, I used to say, like the big four horsemen of podcasting in the early days, especially when this patent troll came, when it was yourself, Tim Ferriss, Adam Carolla, and they were really, I think, preying on the fact that, or hoping that, some of these shows were big enough to just pay and end it, right? Like, that it was, I think, going off of like other patent fights, that the idea was, okay, well, we could just make this so hard on them, they'll just pay and it'll be over. And I think that was like a slight misread of the industry at the time. Like, no one was making enough money to pay and just be done with it. Like, if we had paid up, we would have shut down. Like, that's as simple as that. So, like, they did kind of, in a way, pick the wrong fight, because we were not fighting for a little bit of money. We were fighting for our existence. Thankfully, you guys held firm and let the EFF, and and very grateful with the work EFF did on that.
Amazingly,
everybody. Yeah. I mean, a lot of people in podcasting today have no idea all the work that was done and behind the scenes to make the podcast space even possible.
Yeah, I have to give some credit to someone who does not get enough of it, and that's a guy named Drew Curtis, who people might know his website from, back in the aughts. It was called FARK, F-A-R-K, and he did a lot of kind of pioneering work on fighting these guys. Not even just like, what are they all about, but like, what should you do to beat these guys back? And when I remember meeting with him, and we kind of followed his blueprint to a T about like how this is going to go and what you should do and what you should expect from these shakedown artists. And it wound up being totally right. And so I always make sure to note that Drew Curtis was like a huge part of us surviving that.
All right. We'll get a link to Drew and FARK in the show notes. Shifting gear, I always thought of you as an audio magician because you originally encoded the files at 56 kilobits per second MP3 and sounded better than what everybody else was doing at 128. And do you remember your original setups and how you got that sound at that level?
Yeah, it was really just kind of like a recipe. Like, you have to kind of play around with it. And I remember, I mean, so much of this was the invention of the limits of the technology at the time. So I'm sure you remember that, like, this is, 2009 when we're starting, and iPhones had data restrictions on them. They would not auto download the episode unless it was under a certain file size. And so I just kind of sat there with those initial episodes we made and tried to get them with using, compression rates and just general playing around with the file to get them to a point where they still, to me, sounded the way you would expect something to sound. And I'm coming from a radio background, so I have that kind of stuff hammered into my head, right? Like, this does not go on the air if it doesn't sound like this. And I would just get it to a point where I could feel satisfied with that audio quality, but also meet the size restriction. And we kept that up for a while so that, even when that was no longer a technical limitation, I still found that I was able to, like, get a better sound out of the show than, people who were recording it at a much higher fidelity, but not, being so careful with it in post-production, because I had done all that, because I had, basically built my recipe for how to present the show. And yeah, it just kind of always stuck like that. I was so relieved when it got to a point where I didn't have to get the files so small anymore.
And you, if I remember right, Adobe Audition?
That's what I used from beginning to end.
Okay.
Yeah, and very, very few times did I ever have to use anything else. Like, I would say there's maybe a handful of episodes that I had to have, there was something tremendously wrong with the recording that I had to use something more sophisticated than Adobe to get the inefficiencies out or whatever, but it was rare.
Over these past 16 plus years that you were doing this, did you ever do production work for any other podcasts?
Yeah. The whole time that I've been doing the podcast, I still have been employed at MSNBC. And it was once I was able to leave their show, the nightly show that I was doing, and just work with them on a consultant basis, that I could kind of go back to the podcast and be, an open producer of it. Mm-hmm. But I did still have a connection with them, and as I mentioned, did production consultant work for them. So when it came time for one of the shows that I worked with, Chris Hayes, to do a podcast, they were talking to me, like, about ideas for his podcast, and kind of asking me yay or nay stuff about it. And it got to the point where I was like, guys, what are you doing here? Like, I'll just do it. I can do this. Like, you're asking me this stuff that it's just much easier if I go in there and produce this with you guys and get it off the ground. And I did that for over a year. We did that show together. So there was a period of time where I was producing both WTF and the Chris Hayes Why Is This Happening show. And those are really the main ones. Other than that, I don't think there's been anything else that I've done any kind of regular production on, other than maybe a phone call with somebody to help them out. There were times where I was asked to do Marc's comedy CDs, produce those, but those are about the only other things.
Are you open for people to come to you to do production work?
As of right now, the office is closed.
All right.
But I have no idea what the future holds, and I'm willing to leave all options open. But yes, you will see a Gone Fishing sign on the front door right now.
I noticed on Marc's last episode, last episode, Marc gave you a release of you having to listen to him.
Yes.
Talk. So I thought that was kind of funny.
I have held on to it with great honor and pride, and I have adhered to it. There has been no reason for me to listen to any of Marc's recordings or content, or frankly, I've been on quite the detox of almost all received media for the last 3 or 4 months. But that does not mean I have not talked to Marc. We still talk like weekly, and I'm much happier to just proceed with us having a friendship rather than a work relationship.
Lock the Gates.
Yeah.
Where did that come from?
So that is a soundbite, and for people who don't know, that's the soundbite we used at the beginning of the show. And that is Marc doing a line in the movie Almost Famous. He has a small part as the angry promoter. And if you've seen the movie, it's when the band Stillwater gets electrocuted on the stage and they leave the concert venue. And Mark is this angry promoter who comes out and tells them they got to get back there because, they left early and they wrecked the stage. And he gets in a fight with them. They drive away and he yells, "Lock the gates," to lock this tour bus inside the venue, and they bust through it. So we just always thought that was a fun way to start the show. If you listen to some of the early episodes of WTF, you'll notice like a lot more sonic production that really speaks to our radio background and the type of stuff we would do for terrestrial radio at the time. Like there were a lot of little sound bites and sweepers and just the typical radio production that we were then kind of conscious of the fact that it sounded too much like radio, and we edged back a little bit and then a lot, to the point where we got a couple years in and broke it down to just music and Mark and the guests, and that was it. The production was going to be minimal because that lent itself to the aesthetic of podcasting and of what this show is and what the appeal of the show is, which is I might not be allowed to be hearing this, so thankfully I am. I'm a fly on the wall in this guy's garage. But those early days, we had built these kind of logos and sonic branding, and Lock the Gates just seemed too perfect, and we just never got rid of it. And it, has become a kind of signature for the show, like several other things. Several other things are just things Mark says, like his POW coffee advertisement, and his clothes off to say Boomer Lives, which is our production company. And there are Mark trademarks for sure. And Lock the Gates is probably the most notable one. In the fact, I just was watching the Golden Globes, and there was Mark, and he's saying "Lock the Gates" as part of a segment about the podcast awards.
Nice. Now, you mentioned older episodes, and I looked at the feed, and the first 500 episodes are no longer on the feed. Where where can people find them, or can they? Or?
Yeah, so the library currently is available in full to subscribers through Supercast, and on our website at WTFpod.com, there's like a little link to WTF Plus, and you can get every episode without any ads in it, and I believe it's a $3 a month streaming charge. I think we'll play around with that. We're still kind of freshly off of the regular production merry-go-round, so it feels like a time for us to kind of assess and see what people like and what people are going back to over and over again. And I think all options are on the table for us. Like, might be a situation where people can buy the whole catalog at once. People can buy individual episodes. People can choose to stream them as they're streaming them now, or people can listen to them in their entirety, but with ads placed in them. There's a lot of options to the catalog as it exists. And I get told on a regular basis that people are still listening to stuff. Like, I'll hear from somebody and they say, "Oh, I just heard an old interview that Mark did with Paul Thomas Anderson. It was so great," or whatever. And I kind of feel like that's one of the lasting legacies of the show, is that he did these interviews that are more or less evergreen. And if not evergreen entirely in content, then at least in the sense that it paints a picture of that person at that time in their totality. So like if you wanted to listen to, Mel Brooks talk about his entire life in 2013, from that viewpoint, you'll hear it. You'll hear it listening to that. Now, of course, he's had more life since then. He's had, losses and things that have happened to him. He's had other media projects and that. But at that time, it's a pretty complete look at his life. So I think we've always felt pretty good about that. And we want to keep those available in general to, the majority of the listening audience.
You got to edit 1,600 plus episodes. Any guests when you were editing that you just blew you away? Like maybe they well exceeded expectations, or just were just hilarious, or just heart-wrenching, just any ones that, obviously there's the Robin Williams, but other than that, and President Obama, take the obvious two out of the picture. any others that stood out to you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, because you're editing, right? And you're like really listening for narrative and you're really listening for accuracy, and there's a whole bunch of things going on in your brain. Like, it was very rare for me to get kind of emotionally caught up in an episode. Definitely not in the same way that Marc did, where he talked to certain people and just openly weep, at their stories or whatever. And I'd just be much more likely to be going through them and find them to be pretty extraordinary. But I'm also trying to make sure I'm not going to screw them up, right? Like, it's on me to make sure that emotion translates, and largely it's going to, be an invisible translation into how I did that to the audience, right? The times where I consciously in my head, realized that something extraordinary was happening, I would say would be like, there's like two categories of it. There's the one where I'd be like, wow, I can't believe this is happening. Like, in the sense of like, almost like talking to my younger self. Like, did you ever think, you'd be working on this show where Quentin Tarantino comes over and just tells you all about all of his movies, or Albert Brooks, or the people who were like, heroes to you as a kid, or, fundamental to your sense of humor, Matt Groening creating The Simpsons, and then someday you'll just do a show where you get to hear all about that creation of The Simpsons based on, your guidance of how to ask the questions. That was always extraordinary to me. The ones, though, that stood out like as like blow me away, like if that's the question, like what ones blew you away, it was almost always people I knew nothing about. And, it'd be maybe a comic that Marc knew once. I can think of a guy named Jack Gallagher who talked about raising his autistic son, and it was tremendously moving and impactful for me. Or, I can think of people who had stories that I never knew existed in their lives. Paul Scheer, who I just used to enjoy just as a comedian and listening to How Did This Get Made? And he had this harrowing story about his upbringing, and it was just so awful but compelling, and he told it in a funny way. And those are the moments where I would kind of like pull out of myself and be like, I can't believe this is a thing we made, where like people feel like they can come here and talk about this. Amy Mann feels like she can talk about how her mom kidnapped her. Like, those were the things that blew me away, and I do not take them lightly or take them for granted.
I'm assuming you had some tough edits along the way, and we'll take the Gallagher one out of the picture.
Yeah, that wasn't that tough an edit, frankly, because it was so short. I kept trying to keep as much in as possible.
I've done a bunch of interviews, and sometimes the hardest ones to edit, I found, were the ones where they didn't say much.
For sure, yeah.
Like Ben Kingsley episode was one for you that I remember his answers were terse.
Yeah.
Let's say, to be nice. I'm like thinking, wow, how that had to be like, okay, what was your thought process, if you even remember?
So, okay, you're bringing up one, though, that is like, that's an exception. And the thing about that, so I guess what's interesting is you noticed that, right? You listen to that, you go, sounds difficult, right?
Yes.
I think the reason it sounds difficult was because I left it generally alone, right? Like, we, it's a little background here was that, he showed up and didn't kind of seem to respect that this was the interview that he was doing, and was terse with Marc right from the start, and felt, like he was going to Bigfoot the proceedings and just, avoid questions, go back to the narrative that he had. And it was not the type of interview that we typically do on the show. And so from my part was, I got to leave as much of this in as possible, because I need people to understand that's the story of this interview, not necessarily what's in the interview, but the story of the interview is what's going on in that room, right? So it sounds to you like something difficult is happening. For me, much less so as an edit. The edits that I think are the hardest for me is to go back to something you said in the first place, people who aren't saying much. But it's not people who aren't saying much because they're being aggressive or that's their posture. It might just be, for lack of a better word, they're not very comfortable with this. They're not very compelling speakers. And the thing about that is that doesn't mean they don't have a story or that they don't have something valuable to share. And I always kind of saw it as my job to make those people the best version of themselves. And Those were the hard ones. And I don't want to throw anybody under the bus and say specifically it was this person or that person. But like a good example of one that I think you can hear, it's not me, making something out of something that you wouldn't know.
You're saying the wife of a former rock band member?
Yes, exactly. Courtney Love. Right. If you listen to that, you can hear a very kind of erratic mind, right? I'm not saying her personally, but her mind jumps all over the place, right? And I think even in the edited version of that episode, it sounds a little kind of manic and all over the place. But I can assure you it was 10 times more of that when it existed in its raw form. So that required like a lot of editing. And I think, I've heard from plenty of people that are like, that episode is legendary. And I think that's a good sign. I think that it's good that it comes across the way it does. I also have heard from plenty of people, and again, I don't feel like naming them because it's not their fault that they, felt that it was hard for them to express themselves on mic, but that have said to me like, man, you made me sound so much better than I felt. And that I feel good about that when that happens.
Do you take out the ums, the ahs, the what is some of the things that you do in the editing process?
I have a kind of rule of thumb that you leave in the natural sounds of people's speech. So ums and ahs and that are not a problem until they become one. It's a just kind of very like, I know it when I see it or I hear it kind of thing.
You knows, I had one person I interviewed one time and they had so many you knows and I took them out and then I took out a bunch of them, but I didn't take them all out, right? Because I didn't want to take everything out. And after I took out, which was a lot, the person came back to me and said, hey, can you take out, there's a lot of you knows out. I'm like, dude, you don't know how many I already took out.
Exactly, right. Yeah, that's the thing. When it's like a tick or a affectation, sometimes it's hard on the ear. But I think, again, going back to that idea that I came from a radio background where this stuff was like hammered into you. Like the first job I ever had was at an NPR affiliate, and they're just such sticklers about the audio product, and this was New York Public Radio. It's got to sound polished. And I've been very conscious about that. But at the same time, knowing that we're in this podcast environment where you don't want polish, you don't want it to be totally clean the whole time. And so as much as I could stick to the natural tone of people's speech patterns or their interplay with Marc, I would. When I would hear it becoming a bit of a strain, and sometimes that's from Marc's side too. Like Marc might be like interjecting certain things that are causing, the hiccups to happen, right? And you'd go, okay, I can trim that out, right? But in the longer scope of the show, most of my editing was for narrative purposes, for like, okay, this is going to keep this on track. This is going to keep this interesting to people. Pace is a big reason to edit, and digressions are sometimes fun, but sometimes difficult and irritating for listeners because they want you to stay on the thing that they've been hearing. So I would say most of my editing was primarily editorial and not so much copy editing, for lack of a better way to describe people's inconsistencies of speech.
Did you ever do time shifted where you took something from the end of the episode and moved it back to the middle for a better flow?
Oh, for sure. And sometimes that happened frequently, especially in the early years. Like I could think of one that's like, you could go back and listen to it because I can identify the spot that was earlier. It's the first time Marc had John Oliver on. There was this earlier story that was a total digression about playing sports when they're kids, and it just wound up fitting so much more perfectly at the end of the episode. So like I shifted that, and it doesn't affect the content. Like that was always, I come from a journalism background. So you never want to make something false. You're not trying to take something and give it a new context by putting it in a different place. But if you think you can highlight it better and it can work better, then I think absolutely in the type of thing we're doing, right? I would never do this with a sit-down news interview with a newsmaker, but in the type of thing we were creating, which are these audio profiles of people, absolutely move the thing around if it makes sense somewhere else. Now, what I would say about my process there is that I had to do that less frequently as we moved forward because Marc became a better self-editor, right? As he started to do this hundreds and hundreds of times, had more experience knowing the arc of these things from beginning to end. So he could much more easily wrap up a talk in a way where he knew it was going to punctuate well, or he would, refrain on some type of digression, but then bring it back later on because he knew it was going to be good. I noticed that about him the more we did the show, that he got much better at that himself, and it made my job easier.
Good talent makes the editing process go much smoother. Thank you, Marc, for saving Brendan lots of
For sure.
Now that the show's over, was there anyone on your not Marc's list, but your personal list that you would have I wish Marc had gotten this person on? It never worked out time-wise, or they just never replied, or they, for whatever reason, or maybe you just never reached out to someone you wish you would have heard an interview on.
I mean, there's kind of a yes to that, but I would say overall no, because, when we knew we were wrapping up and we had enough time, we gave ourselves a bit of an off-ramp. We went out directly to a lot of the people who were or basically all of the people, any of the people that were people we never got before, like that.
Mark Hamill?
What's that?
Mark Hamill, maybe?
Oh, Mark Hamill, yeah, he was one, and he came through. Matt Groening, he was another one. Christopher Guest, but there were people like Steve Martin, Tina Fey, Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg. Those are the ones off the top of my head that I'm I would love for us to do these people before we end, and I've always wanted to do any one of them, right? And they'd always said no in the past, and then they passed as we were ending as well. And my reaction to that was less man, I wish we could have gotten them, and more well, I guess it's good that we didn't, because they're actually not everyone needs to do this, right? Not everyone's comfortable with doing this type of show that we do, where, Marc is going to want to talk to them about the whole kit and caboodle, their whole lives. If there's any kind of unifying aspect to Marc's interviews, he has said this himself, and I'm not extrapolating this. He has said that if he can find out what this person seemed like as a kid, what they were doing, what they were thinking, where they lived, whether they had people around them, brothers, sisters, friends, what their family was like, if he can get a picture of that little kid, it gives him a much better route to understanding the person, right? And I watch a movie like The Fabelmans, which is essentially Steven Spielberg's, autobiography of himself. And I come away from that film, which I like very much, thinking, I still don't know that guy. I know what he thinks is the good story that happened to him, but I don't know that guy. And I think that's probably true with the people who didn't do the show, that they totally fairly want to keep themselves. They to themselves. They don't feel they need to be an open book everywhere they go. And I feel like anyone that falls into that category did the show, or anyone that falls into that category that we pursued wound up doing the show and wound up giving of themselves to us. And I don't take for granted that that's a big ask, right? That people shouldn't be required in an interview to be extraordinarily personal. And I know I wouldn't like it if it were me. So that's a kind of full-throated way to answer your question. Is there anyone that I really wish we had on? It's ultimately, I don't wish we had those people on, because I wouldn't have wanted to do the talk and edit the episode if they weren't fully into it.
All right. On the prep work Marc did for the interviews, did you help him? Did he do all that? What kind of prep work were there for interviews?
Yeah, it's weird it's almost the reverse of what you'd expect, in that when we were newly doing the show, it was almost like an imperative. Don't research and go in there dry, right? Go in there with, no agenda and just try to talk. And I think that was fairly successful because it was all mostly comedians, and they could just have the kind of conversation that Marc would have in the green room with somebody, right? I think what happened was, as the show progressed and we started getting people in from all walks of life, it became more important to make sure things weren't missed, right? So I think my initial drilling down on research for Marc was like making sure if a guest was coming in, he knew all of their milestones so that it didn't get to a person and be like, oh, you won an Oscar, right? Like I didn't know about that or whatever. and then that, I think, I want to make sure I'm not framing this negatively. It's not negative to Marc, but I think, especially as these things get older and go on longer, it just becomes harder to engage your muscles on all of them at all times. By all of them, I mean like every single interview. So like you become a person who does the thing in the moment, but it would be too draining to every single person that's coming into that garage. You have to sit down and do like a term paper's worth of research on that person. Now, Marc was very good at like watching movies that people made, listening to their albums, reading books. He probably read more books doing this show than he did in college. But the biographical stuff, that usually fell to me. And I was more than happy to do it. Like I would kind of feel that was my way without ever, Marc never went off of a list of questions or notes. But I kind of felt like my ability to give him like kind of bullet point biographical stuff was a way to outline the interview informally so that he would read these bullet points and then have a general outline structure in his head when he talked to this person. I found through trial and error that giving him too much was often the wrong thing because he could then kind of over-determine the interview and not let it move as naturally as it should have. So it just became a balance of like, give him the right research and not all the research. And yeah, we just basically had a little dossier on everybody. And it was, primarily my stuff in print and Marc's stuff in, practice. He would watch things or listen to things or read things.
During all those interviews, did you ever lose one?
Yes, we lost a John Hodgman interview twice. Well, I would say the second one wasn't lost. It was just that we decided not to use it. But the first time Marc interviewed him, he recorded it in the office of his manager. They shared a manager at the time. So Marc was in New York. John Hodgman came into the office. They recorded it, and Marc has no idea what happened. He hit stop and left and thought everything was fine. And he sent me the file, and it was the wrong file. And I said, nope, this isn't it. This is the one you sent me already. And he went looking for it, and it was just gone. So that was gone. We then had John back for a live show we recorded at a food festival in Brooklyn. And Marc hated the episode so much, we never aired it. Not because of John, it was because of the environment. It was too loud. There weren't people.
Audio quality.
Yeah, it was more that they plopped a podcast stage down in the middle of a food festival and no one was paying attention. So he was just, it was a festival that never lasted more than, I think it happened a second year, and then went away. And so John Hodgman is a guy we had to do 3 times before actually airing his episode. And another one that we lost was Kevin Allison, who was the host of the show Risk, and one of the members of The State. He came on and something totally crazy happened in the recording where it was, we've had bad recordings that had you get something that causes a problem, but that the problem can be removed. There was no removing it. It was everybody was turned into robots, right? And not even in the way you could understand what they were saying, just total garbled robot noise coming out of each person. So that was gone. We had to record that one again, but thankfully it was those 2 and no others. There have been episodes we didn't air, and it wasn't because we lost them. It was because decision was made to not air them, but nothing other than those 2 were actually lost.
I want to just do a quick thank you here. President Obama's interview, the first one, I knew when you uploaded. So I had my kids, they were 7 and 9, and my wife, I was like, oh, I know Brent's going to have it uploaded. I checked, sure enough, that Sunday night, the night before it went live, it was up. So we went and we listened to it early, which the kids thought was really great. And then at the end, Marc does some shout outs, thank yous, and then thank me in that. So if you had any help with recommending me in that, I just want to say thank you. Thank you to Marc, because my kids thought that was like the coolest thing is listen to the president speak and then hear your dad mentioned. I mean, like that was like my favorite podcasting moment. That was just really, really cool.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm glad you had that, and it was not frivolous. Obviously, we wanted to thank on that episode the people who got us to that point. So you're absolutely one of them.
I appreciate that, and I always loved Mark's show and loved helping you guys. And I know there were many emails. I mean, we had a lot of emails back and forth in the days, and I remember when you guys started the premium, right? We started the premium with you, and we updated it, and I shouldn't even say we. I don't know if you know this now, but I'm not with Libsyn anymore. So as of last month.
Oh no, I did not know that.
Yes, there was one of those. Hey, we're going to go in a different direction.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
So what are we doing this on right now?
Well, we're recording this on my account. I was going to record it on a different account. But this is for Podcast 411. So this is for my own personal podcast.
Right.
And now I had relaunched, talk about a podcast come to the end, right? I was doing the feed with Elsie at Libsyn, and I had done that every other week. And it got to the point where I couldn't do Podcast 411 anymore because it was like, okay, it was just too hard with the day job and everything else.
Yeah.
So I kind of put it on hiatus, and then they said, oh no, we don't want you to do the feed anymore. And then after that, they said, we don't want you to do anything anymore. Yeah. So it was a surprise, but I had brought back Podcast 411, and you were always on my list of people who I wanted to interview. And I even actually said, when I relaunched it, I said, I want to talk to the Brendans and like the Nick and other people that are behind the scenes that are doing the editing rather than the talent so much. Although I'd love to talk to Mark, don't get me wrong, but I more look at myself as an editor first, a podcaster second.
Yeah.
And I happen to have a show, which I, through the power of my editing, make myself sound good. I don't think I could give my show to anyone else and make me sound good. Although, no, that's not true. John did a really good job who edited the feed. So I have to actually have him on because he was my editor. But for this show, I do it myself. And again, I want to talk more to you because I've always really, really respected what you did with Mark's show. And when I listened to the show, I was listening twofold. I was listening to the content, but I was listening to the edits. I was listening to the stuff like I said, like the Ben Kingsley one. I was like,
yeah,
like, oh, that's gotta be a tough one to edit because that one stuck out in my head. But then just how great a job you did in the transitions, and I could tell like you could hear movement, but it was really good.
Yeah,
you did. That's why I wanted to have you on here.
Well, I appreciate it. I mean,
as a fan of yours and Mark's,
yeah, no,
fan of yours of what you did behind the scene.
That's the kind of thing where I always knew that there were my goal was always to be in the background, right? I didn't want to be kind of front facing with the show, but I always knew there would be people out there who knew, right? Just mostly because they'd be people who did it themselves or just had a general understanding of production. I always had people like you in my mind when I was working to know that, like, hey, if you slack on this, there are going to be people who know.
And I remember when I started early on, there were people that let me know when I wasn't doing a good job. Like, Rob, you say content's king. Well, the queen's left the building. You still have to edit. You got to get the audio right. And
yeah.
I learned over time. My running joke was I used to say I was such a good editor I could edit President Bush to sound like President Obama. One funny thing, when I remember bringing you ads, offering up ads. One time I was asked, and they're like, we had Ashley Madison as an advertiser.
Oh, right.
And I don't know if you remember this, but I remember I'm like, I'm not going to ask them. You got to ask them. I'm like, I'm not going to ask them. They're going to say no. You need to ask. I'm like, oh, please don't make me ask Mark if he's going to take Ashley Madison as advertiser. There's zero chance. And sure enough, I asked, and it was no, but it wasn't just no. It was like, I think Mark's response was something along the lines of, hey, no, and also to let him know if Satan wanted to run some spots to help update his image. Something to that effect. I don't know if you remember that, but were there any other crazy advertisers other than Ashley Madison that were presented to you guys over the years that you just said, no?
I mean, it's funny because I don't remember that specific one, but because I remember there were plenty that were like that, right? And the feeling that Mark and I always had from the start was if it was a thing he could use or, was comfortable with using, then he'd do the ad for it. And even if he didn't use it himself, like Adam and Eve, that's a perfect example. And it's probably why they thought, well, you got to ask him about Ashley Madison. He's doing Adam and Eve. And to like an ad sales perspective, it's like those two things seem interchangeable, right? It's just like there's some sex thing involved. And for Mark, it was like, no, one is a thing for sexual positivity and like consenting adults to, have sexual relationships with themselves and enjoy, the glory of their bodies. And one is the website that lets you create hookups to cheat on your spouse. And like, there's a difference there. And he's like, one of those, I don't use either of them. But one of those I'm not opposed to using. I'm not opposed to getting condoms off of Adam and Eve, right? And I think that was just our guiding principle for advertising. And I really want to shout out Jeff Ulrich and Midroll when they built that, and a couple of the high-profile salespeople there and accounts people there. Lex Friedman was another guy that I remember was very, very careful about this. Like, they knew the importance of matching the advertiser with the right shows. And like, they always would say that to these clients, that they're like, do you want to waste your money or not? Right? Like, it's a waste of money if you're advertising on the show where the guy doesn't care about the product. So I know you really want Marc Maron to do this, but it's not going to be a good ad. And so we're not even going to present it to him. And that happened a lot. And then it happened in the opposite, where they'd be like, coming to them and trying to do a small ad buy across smaller shows. And it'd be like, I don't know, Dunkin' Donuts or something. And they'd be like, do you know how much Marc Maron talks about Dunkin' Donuts? Like, you absolutely should up your buy and buy on that show because he will promote the hell out of Dunkin' Donuts and it would work, So I think that was a huge thing for us in the early days. It became discouraging as that market kind of became glutted and there was less care to it. And we absolutely noticed it when we moved off of Midroll, that there just wasn't as much product integration with the content. I know people who still do shows through SiriusXM, and they purchased Midroll and Earwolf and Stitcher, that entire package, and integrated a lot of their people into the SiriusXM podcast division. And the people I know who work over there at SiriusXM say they are excellent at selling ads for shows, tailored to the shows. And I think that's totally because of the groundwork that was done when Midroll was built.
Brendan, once again, where can people go to find the back catalog of WTF?
Well, yeah, if you go to the WTF website, WTFpod.com, there's a button right at the top that says WTF Plus, and that takes you to Supercast. You could also just go to supercast.com and search WTF. And it's a $3 a month streaming fee. You can listen to the whole thing from start to finish. I know the reporter Dave Weigel is doing that right now, and I'm very much enjoying following his listen along. Every few days he posts something from the show that he heard that he was like, oh my God, I had no idea about this episode, of episode 120 or whatever. It's very fun living that stuff again through somebody else's eyes. So yeah, I recommend if anybody had interest in the show at one point but never heard the whole thing, that's there for you. It's there to do. And there are still, 1,000+ episodes that are available for free, and those are on our website.
Brendan, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Rob, it's my pleasure, and thank you for being there from the very beginning. I really appreciate it.
Thanks again to Brendan for being a guest on the show, and please check out the links in the show notes for episode 239. And now into the news, tips, and tricks segment of the show. I got an Oura ring from my wife for Christmas. And one of the things it does, it'll tell you when you're stressed throughout the day. And when I was at PodFest, I was taking a look at when I was most relaxed and when I was most stressed. And early on that Friday at PodFest, I spoke on the state of podcasting, which during that session, I was the most calm I was all day. That had the least amount of anxiety. But the most anxiety I had that day was the Hall of Fame speech that I had to, introduction speech I had to do for Julie. See, what happened is the best public speaker I've ever seen, ever, in person, Dave Ramsey, without a doubt. He is someone I'm in awe of. I mean, I just watch how he speaks and moves. Incredible, the best speaker, period. So when at the Podcast Hall of Fame, I was excited to see and meet Dave Ramsey, but I was also nervous because I had to speak right after Dave. Dave, he didn't just set the bar high. It was like pole vaulting high where he set the bar. And I felt like all I had was an old wooden yardstick from Ace Hardware. Anyway, here is the introduction I had for Julie Samuels. For those that have not seen the video or did see the video and want to know how it was supposed to have been read, here we go. I am honored to introduce our next inductee, Julie Samuels. Julie is a superhero that many podcasters do not know they should be thankful for. To be considered a superhero, you do need a supervillain to fight, and in early 2013, said supervillain appeared in the podcasting community. It was a patent troll that went by the name of Personal Audio LLC. They had a patent they claimed covered podcasting and sued Adam Carolla and How Stuff Works, and also sent out shakedown letters demanding money to Jesse Thorne, Marc Maron, Sam Cedar, and others. Most podcasters at the time had no idea how dire things looked. Personal Audio beat Apple in a suit over a patent for playlists. A jury in 2011 awarded them $8 million. So when Personal Audio came after podcasters, it was looking like maybe podcasting might be snuffed out before it really had a chance to grow. In this origin story, this is where Julie Samuels enters the picture, having one of the coolest titles ever, Staff Attorney, Mark Cuban Chair to Eliminate Stupid Patents with the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Julie started off talking to those contacted by the patent troll, and then on February 5th, 2013, Julie put up a post on the EFF site titled, quote, "Podcast community faces patent troll threat. EFF wants to help," unquote. And in that post, she said, quote, "Are you a podcaster? Have you received a letter from Personal Audio? We think there are more of you out there than you realize. The EFF would like to understand how big this problem is and make sure you're all in touch with each other. We can also help you find counsel. If you have heard from Personal Audio, please send us an email," unquote. And on May 30th, 2013, came an email from Julie to me and some others, quote, "DFF is excited to announce it plans to challenge Personal Audio at the Patent Office. Here is the thing. We need your help. Please spread the word to your networks via podcast, Twitter, Facebook, etc. With your donations, we're confident we can take on this bad news patent," unquote. In a superhero movie, this would be where the villain was slain, but sadly, the legal system moves a little slower. It was not until April 2015 that the patent was invalidated, and then 2017 before a federal circuit court affirmed the invalidation, and finally May 14th, 2018, until the Supreme Court denied the appeal and ended this fight. Folks, not all superheroes wear capes, but sometimes they do have a business card that says Staff Attorney, Mark Cuban, Chair to Eliminate Stupid Patents. To Julie Samuels, from all podcasters, thanks for saving podcasting and welcome to the Podcast Hall of Fame. And that is how it was supposed to go, which likely was a little different from the video of the Hall of Fame ceremony, which I'll have a link in the show notes. I have one other news item. It's some other things. I'm going to drop them off this episode. We'll have them on the next one. But one item I definitely want to talk about this week in the news is Apple Podcasts will support HLS video. Apple just announced that. Now, I've heard some people say Apple is now supporting video in Apple Podcasts for the first time. Let's get this straight. Apple has always supported video in Apple Podcasts and in the podcast section of iTunes prior to that, all the way back to June 2005. Video podcasts have been a thing with Apple as long as audio podcasts have been a thing. Supporting video is not new for Apple. What is new is Apple is supporting HLS video. What is HLS video, you ask? HLS stands for HTTP live streaming. It is a widely used video streaming protocol developed by Apple and first released in 2009. Despite the name, including live, HLS is used for both live streaming, and on-demand video, i.e. now podcasts. HLS is one of the dominant standards for delivering video over the internet today. It powers much of the video you watch on iOS devices, Safari browsers, many smart TVs, streaming apps, and web players. Part of the HLS video is having multiple versions of a video available, i.e. 360p version, 720p version, 1080p version of a file. Then, depending on the strength of the connection at the end user, delivering the highest quality version that will not cause choppy video playback. Each version is cut into small chunks of a few seconds long or so. And then as connection speeds change for the end user, a different version of the file could be delivered. For example, you could start out on your smartphone in your car and have a poor connection, so you're getting it at the video at 360p version of the byte ranges. But 10 minutes into the video, you get home and connect to your Eero router that is connected to fiber. And then the video switches to the 1080p version or whatever the best version available. There's some 4K is also available, but please don't do that. But anyway, the 1080p version of the byte ranges are then delivered. What Apple is rolling out is support in Apple Podcasts to also additionally switch between the audio version and the video versions of an episode. From Apple, quote, "A fan can start listening on the go, then instantly switch to video when they get home, right where they left off. Apple Podcasts now supports video delivery using HLS, a new standard for podcasts that enhances the experience without interrupting the features you and your audience rely on. Followers and downloads continue to work the same, and your audience can engage with your show as they always have," unquote. For this to work, the end user needs to be running iOS 26.4, which was just released on February 16th as a beta, the first version of beta, with iOS 26.3 being fully released to the masses just a few days earlier on February 11th. Likely, iOS 26.4 will not be released to the masses, means getting it out of beta, until April, best case, based on past cadences between a .3 and a .4 release of iOS. Which means we'll be talking about this more and more over the next 2 months, and something we'll be covering in much, much greater detail on the official Captivate podcast in the near future. For full and fair disclosure, while my day job is with Captivate DAX US Global, the thoughts and opinions shared on this podcast are solely those of my own and my guests. They do not reflect the thoughts, opinions, or official positions of any other third party. When quoting anything said on this podcast, please give attribution to Rob at Podcast 411 or to the guest per how their name appears in the title of this episode. This show is presented under a CC BY-SA license. Grok it if you are not sure what it is. Finally, don't forget to send in your feedback for anything said or that should have been said in this episode. You can record that feedback and email it to me, podcast411@gmail.com, or you can call me, 206-MOM-HELP, that's 206-666-4357. Until the next time. Ciao. Brendan, I am recording, but we're not yet in the show. When I say, Brendan, welcome to the show, from that point on, anything's fair game. However, I do edit heavy, so if there's anything you want me to take out, just let me know before the recording ends, and we'll make sure it gets taken out.
Okay.
Post. And you're okay with this going up on Podcast 411?
Yeah, all good.
All right. Good. There's my audio waiver. I should ask that question, what you guys did for waivers.
It was basically that. It was just a verbal on mic acknowledgement